Snow came sideways that night, a blizzard so thick it felt like the sky itself was being torn apart and thrown to the ground. The little railway station on the edge of the plains didn't stand against the storm. It surrendered, groaning under the weight of the snow like an old man giving up the ghost. A single lantern swung on a rusty hook, its light weak and yellow, not a beacon of hope, but a warning of how easily a light could be snuffed out. And in that weak, flickering light, two impossible shapes appeared. Two little girls, no older than 6, huddled together in dresses so thin you could see the cold right through them. Their feet were bare, black with soot and turning a bruised purple from the frost biting at the floorboards. They were small, almost nothing against the howling fury of the night, but their eyes held something ancient and heavy. It was the look of being thrown away, a hurt so deep it carves itself right into the bone. They'd been cast out, simple as that. Their own family had tossed them out like garbage, and the storm was all they had left. The older one, her own small body shaking uncontrollably, wrapped a skinny arm around her sister. She leaned in close, her lips already blue, and whispered a promise she couldn't possibly keep. "Hold on," she breathed, her words turning to ice in the air. "We'll be found." It wasn't a promise born of hope, it was a promise born of terror, because the only thing scarier than the storm was the silence waiting on the other side of it. Across the platform, a man sat alone on a long wooden bench. He was just a shape in the dark, a hat resting on his lap. His eyes locked on the train tracks that disappeared into the white chaos. 27 years he'd been on this earth, but the frontier had a way of aging a man, beating the youth out of him with hardship and loneliness. His name was a mystery to most, and he liked it that way. His hands were a roadmap of scars and calluses. His shoulders broad from work, not pride. He carried a silence that was louder and more dangerous than any threat. He was waiting for a supply train, nothing more. But when he finally looked up, his eyes catching the flicker of movement in the lantern light, he didn't see iron and steam. He saw two little birds, their wings broken, trembling on the edge of a world that was about to swallow them whole. At first, he figured it was a trick of the light. The snow could play games with a man's eyes, make him see ghosts where there was nothing. But then the wind changed direction for just a second, and a tiny sound cut through the howl. A sob, a sound so small and broken it traveled straight past his ears and lodged itself deep in the hollow part of his chest. He rose slowly, his heavy boots thudding against the frozen wood, each step a crack of thunder in the quiet. The girls saw him coming and clung to each other so tightly it looked like they were trying to merge into one person. They saw him not as a savior, but as just another danger in a night full of them. He crouched down, bringing his big frame to their level, the creak of his leather coat sounding impossibly loud. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Where's your folks?" The older one, the brave one, met his gaze. There was no fear left in her, only the raw courage of someone with nothing left to lose. "She slammed the door," the girl said, her words coming out in shivering bursts. The truth in them, though, burned hot and steady. "Grandma said we weren't hers to keep. She said Mama's gone and Papa's gone, and so are we." The younger girl just buried her face in her sister's shoulder, her small body racked with silent sobs. The man let out a long breath, the air turning to a thick white cloud in front of his face. For a second, he wasn't there on that platform. He was a boy again, feeling the sting of his own father's hand across his jaw, standing over his mother's fresh grave while the ground was still too frozen to properly mourn. He knew this feeling. He knew the shape of abandonment. It was a brand seared into his own soul. He didn't reach for them, not yet. Instead, he did the only thing he could think to do. He shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the one thing standing between him and the killing cold, and draped it over their tiny, shivering shoulders. The sudden weight and warmth of it startled them, but then it steadied them. He spoke again, the words feeling foreign in his mouth, dragged up from a place he thought he'd sealed off forever. "Well," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, "from now on, you'll not be left in the cold again. From now on. I reckon I'm your father." The older girl just blinked, her mind trying to make sense of the words. Men didn't make promises like that, not to them. But there was something in the way he looked at them. Not down at them, but at them, his head lowered, that made her loosen her death grip on her sister just enough to let a little bit of his warmth seep in. She whispered a single question, a test. "Are you kind?" He didn't answer right away. Out here, a man's word was his bond, and a broken promise could haunt you worse than any ghost. He let the silence stretch, the only sound the screaming wind. Finally, he looked her square in the eye. "I'll do my best," he said, his voice low and certain. "That's all I've got." Just then, a train whistle blew in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that the storm tried to swallow. The girls shivered under his coat, and the man stood, motioning for them to follow him to the bench. They went without a word, not because they trusted him, but because the night had run out of other options. He sat, placing his hat on the bench beside him, and they immediately pressed against his sides, seeking the warmth and solidity of him. The younger one, exhausted by the fear and the cold, fell asleep almost instantly, her head a dead weight on his arm. The older one stayed awake, her gaze fixed on him, her eyes holding the wary caution of a trapped animal. Her small hand slowly, tentatively, crept toward his. She didn't try to hold it. She just rested her fingers on the back of his hand, a touch as light as a snowflake, testing to see if he would pull away. He didn't. He kept his hand perfectly still, his eyes staring out at the tracks that vanished into the endless white. He felt the crushing weight of a choice he never intended to make. He'd come to the station for feed and nails, simple things. Instead, it felt like God himself had dropped the world in his lap, something so fragile and precious that the slightest misstep could shatter it, and him forever. The wind rattled a loose sign on the station roof, and the lantern flame guttered, threatening to die. The storm was getting worse, erasing any path back to the life the girls had known before. All that was left in the entire world, it seemed, was this one long bench, one man's coat stretched over two small bodies, and the terrifying, uncertain start of a family that nobody had asked for. The older girl, fighting off sleep, murmured one last thing, as if to remind him and herself of the cold, hard truth. We weren't her blood enough to keep. His jaw tightened. His voice, when he answered, was as steady and final as the bedrock beneath the plains. "Blood don't make a home," he said, his words a solemn vow. "Heart does. You'll see." The train whistle screamed again, much closer this time, the sound of iron wheels grinding against the frozen tracks cut through the storm, and the man knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the snow, that this was it. The moment was set in stone. By the time that train pulled into the station, the girls wouldn't be alone anymore, and he would no longer belong just to himself. But as he looked down at the sleeping child on his arm, he saw a small, peculiar scar just below her hairline, a shape he hadn't noticed before. It was a crude star, almost like a brand. And a cold, sick feeling began to crawl up his spine. He had seen that mark before, a long, long time ago, in a place he had sworn he would never return to. The cabin was little more than a box of rough-hewn pine boards, hunkered down on the edge of the plains as if trying to hide from the vast, empty sky. A single window glowed with a tired orange light. The rancher pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and a gust of wind followed them inside. The two little girls, still swallowed by his massive coat, clung to his legs like he was the only solid thing in the universe. The warmth inside was thin, just the lingering heat from a fire that had burned down to embers, mixed with the smell of old smoke and solitude. But it was a world away from the frozen station platform. He helped them over the threshold, his boots kicking clumps of snow onto the floorboards, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the two children let out a breath that wasn't stolen by the cold. The older girl's eyes darted around the small space, taking in the single narrow cot, the rough wooden table, the shelves holding a few chipped tin plates and jars of beans. It was a palace compared to the storm, but it was also a prison of loneliness. The younger girl didn't even look. She just pressed her face harder into his leg, too exhausted to care where she was, as long as it was somewhere. The man moved with an awkwardness that didn't match his size. He was a man of saddles and rope, of horses and earth, not small hands and wide, questioning eyes. He settled them on the threadbare rug by the hearth, then stoked the fire back to life. He fetched a pot and filled it with the last of his beans and a chunk of cornbread from the night before. They watched his every move, their silence a heavy blanket in the small room. They weren't just watching a man make food, they were watching to see if he was safe, if the kindness he'd shown them was real or just a mask. When he placed the steaming bowls in front of them, they ate with a desperate hunger that went deeper than their stomachs. They shoveled the food into their mouths as if trying to prove to themselves that they were still alive, that they had survived. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest, afraid to speak, afraid that any word might shatter the fragile peace that had settled over them. Finally, the older girl looked up, crumbs clinging to her lips. "Do you live here all alone?" she asked, her voice small. The question hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't spoken about his solitude in years. He hadn't needed to. It was just a fact, like the sunrise. "Just me and the horses," he managed to say, his throat tight. The girl nodded slowly, as if she were filing this information away, adding it to a mental ledger. She shot a quick, secret look at her sister, a silent communication passing between them. Then she whispered, so quietly he almost didn't hear it, "Then maybe you won't mind if we stay." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Out here on the plains, words had weight. They could anchor a man, or they could drown him. He rubbed a calloused thumb over his jaw, his gaze drifting to the window where the snow was still pressing against the glass, like a living thing trying to get in. In the heavy silence that followed, the younger girl's voice rose, small and hoarse, like a lost bird's cry. "Are you kind?" And just like that, something inside him that had been frozen for years finally broke. He remembered all the nights he had asked the world that same question, and the world had answered with fists, with silence, with loss. His own voice, when it came, was low and steady, a promise forged in his own pain. "I'll try, little one. That's the best a man can promise." The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Shadows danced on the walls, making the small room feel alive and restless. The girls huddled closer together, whispering secrets he couldn't hear, before finally succumbing to their exhaustion, slumping into a deep sleep on the bearskin rug. He covered them with his only blanket, his large, scarred hands fumbling with the edges, his touch so careful you'd think they were made of glass. He sat up long into the night, just watching them, listening to the soft, even sound of their breathing. Every noise in the cabin sounded different now. The whistle of the wind through the cracks, the groan of the timber, the pop of the fire. They were no longer sounds of emptiness. It was as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if this strange, broken little family could actually hold together. But the image of that scar, that crude star on the younger girl's forehead, kept flashing in his mind. It was a cattle brand, one he recognized. It was the mark of a ruthless rancher from down south, a man named Blackwood, who was more of an outlaw than a cattleman. A man the rancher himself had crossed paths with years ago, in a life he had tried to bury. What was Blackwood's brand doing on a little girl's head? The question settled in his gut, like a cold stone, a premonition that this storm had brought more than just two orphans to his door. It had brought his past right back with it. Morning came pale and grey. The storm had passed, but it left behind a world buried in white. The rancher was outside, splitting wood with the rhythmic, practiced swings of a man who knew his work. Each breath he took was a cloud of steam in the frigid air. From the cabin doorway, the older girl watched him, her hair a tangled mess, her face serious. She held her sister's hand, and it seemed like even the simple act of standing on the porch took a world of courage. The world outside the cabin was waking up too, and it was watching. A neighbor's wagon slowed as it passed on the half-cleared road. The driver leaned over, his eyes sharp and full of questions. "You taking in strays now, Jed?" he called out, the words a mix of a joke and an accusation. Jedediah didn't answer. He just tipped his hat and went back to his work, the axe splitting a log with a clean, sharp crack. The girls, sensing the suspicion in the man's voice, shrank back behind his leg, their faces pale in the cold morning light. Later that day, he had to go into town for flour and sugar. The whispers followed him down the main street, clinging to him like burrs. He walked into the general store, and the low hum of conversation stopped. Every eye was on him. A woman in a dark shawl muttered to her friend, just loud enough for him to hear, "A man alone." Ain't right for him to take in children. Not without a reason. The words stung, but when he turned to leave, he saw the two girls waiting for him by the door, their hands gripping each other's, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a fragile, new-found faith in him. The sight of them, standing there, waiting for him, burned away the shame and the anger. He slung the sack of flour over his shoulder and walked straight past the gossiping townsfolk without a second glance. That evening, he got another visitor. The preacher. He stood in the doorway, snow still clinging to his black coat, a heavy Bible in his hand. His voice was soft, but his eyes were like drills, trying to bore into Jed's soul. "The good book says to defend the poor and the fatherless, Jedediah," the preacher said, his gaze sweeping over the two girls huddled by the fire. "Do justice to the afflicted and the needy." Jed just nodded, letting the words hang in the air between them. He knew what the preacher was really asking. He was asking if Jed was a righteous man or if he was something else entirely. When the preacher left, his words stayed behind, echoing in the rafters like a vow Jed hadn't chosen but one he was now bound to. Night fell again. The girls sat at the table, their bare feet swinging, while Jed sat by the fire, trying to patch their worn-out shoes with a thick needle and some scrap leather. His stitches were clumsy and crooked, but his hands were steady and careful. The older girl watched him, a look of quiet wonder on her face, as if each clumsy stitch was another thread binding her to this strange, silent man. When the fire burned low, he carried them to his cot, tucking them in together under the blanket. He took the hard wooden chair by the door for himself, planning to watch over them through the night. Sleep wouldn't come. He stared into the glowing embers, the town's whispers, and the preacher's words swirling in his mind. For the first time in a decade, he felt the weight of a life that wasn't just his own. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. Then the younger girl stirred in her sleep. She mumbled a single word, a word that shattered the silence and nearly broke him in two. "Papa." He squeezed his eyes shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. A single word from a sleeping child had just redefined his entire existence. In that moment, he knew there was no going back. The girls were his now, and he was theirs. But as he sat there in the dark, the weight of that new name settling on him, the image of the star-shaped brand burned even brighter in his mind. The preacher's words about justice came back to him. What if taking these girls in wasn't an act of mercy? What if it was an act of reckoning? Blackwood wasn't a man who let things go. If these were his children, or connected to him somehow, then Jedediah hadn't just saved two orphans from a storm. He had just declared war on a ghost from his past, a ghost who was very much alive and very, very dangerous. Sunday morning arrived with a sky so clear and blue it hurt to look at. But the frost still clung to everything, a glittering silver warning that winter wasn't done yet. The town came to life slowly, the sound of wagon wheels rattling on frozen ground and church bells calling the faithful to worship. Jed rode in on his horse, sitting tall in the saddle. The two girls were perched in front of him, sharing the space, their old dresses clean but frayed around the edges. Every head turned as they passed. Some folks nodded, their faces unreadable. Others just stared, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. He dismounted at the church, lifting the girls down one by one. They immediately grabbed his hands, their small palms pressing into his rough, calloused fingers. Together, the three of them, this strange patchwork family, walked through the church doors. The air inside was thick with the smell of old wood, candle wax, and judgment. Jed could feel the eyes on his back as he led the girls to an empty pew. He sat between them, their bare feet dangling high above the floorboards, and he bowed his head, but the prayers wouldn't come. The weight of all those stairs was pressing down on him, suffocating him. Whispers slithered through the pews like snakes in the grass. Orphans. Castaways. Not his blood. A widow with eyes as sharp as needles leaned toward her neighbor. "Nothing good comes of strays," she murmured, her voice carrying in the still air. "They carry curses, same as coyotes." The words hit their mark. The older girl stiffened beside him, her small fingers digging into his arm. The preacher's voice boomed from the pulpit, reading scripture about the weary finding rest, but the message was lost in the rustle of doubt and suspicion. When it came time to sing a hymn, the girls' voices were soft and hesitant, but clear and pure, like wildflowers pushing up through frozen ground. For a moment, their singing drowned out the whispers. But only for a moment. After the service, the congregation spilled out into the harsh sunlight, and the murmurs started up again, louder and sharper this time. Jed had to stop at the general store for flour, and the gossip followed him there, gathering like flies on a hot day. A man in dusty overalls spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Reckon a single fella taking in 2 little girls," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "It don't sit right. Ain't natural." Another man chimed in. "Best he send 'em to the orphanage in the next county. That's what it's there for." Jed's jaw worked, a muscle twitching in his cheek, but he didn't say a word. He paid for his flour, hoisted the heavy sack onto his shoulder, and walked out of the store. The older girl walked behind him, her arm wrapped protectively around her sister, her eyes narrowed not with fear, but with a fierce burning defiance. She leaned into the back of his coat and whispered, "They don't know you. They don't see." Back at the cabin, he tried to shake the town's poison from his mind, but the words lingered, sharp and stinging. He set to work mending a fence, the familiar labor a comfort. The girls played nearby, stacking small stones into crooked towers, their laughter a fragile sound in the vast emptiness of the plains. Each laugh was a reminder of how much he had already come to need them, how their presence had filled a hollow space in him he hadn't even known was there. But the doubt was a poison too, seeping into his own thoughts. Could he do this? Could he really raise them? How could he protect them from a world that was already so determined to hate them, to cast them out? That evening, as the fire crackled and threw dancing shadows on the walls, the older girl approached him. She was holding a small piece of faded red ribbon. She stood before him, her face as solemn as a judge's, and carefully, with intense concentration, she tied the ribbon around the band of his old, weather-beaten hat. When she was finished, she stepped back and looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Now it's not just yours," she said, her voice filled with a simple, profound certainty. "It's ours." Something inside him that had been hard and brittle for years suddenly softened. He reached up and touched the ribbon, then settled the hat back on his head. It felt heavier now, weighted with a meaning he was just beginning to understand. For the first time since his own mother had died, he let himself smile, a real smile that reached his eyes. The girls saw it and giggled, a sound of pure joy that seemed to chase the last of the shadows from the corners of the small cabin. But the judgment of the town was still out there, a storm gathering on the horizon. The preacher's words echoed in his head, "Defend the fatherless." He was beginning to understand that defending them meant more than just giving them food and shelter. It meant standing against an entire town, against their fear and their suspicion. It meant being willing to fight. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, he stepped outside. The stars were scattered across the black sky, sharp and cold and impossibly distant. He leaned against the fence rail, his hat in his hands, the little red ribbon a splash of color in the moonlight. He spoke to the darkness, his voice low and rough. "Maybe a man don't need to be blood to be called father." The words hung in the cold, still air, a declaration made to the night itself. Behind him, the cabin glowed, a fragile beacon of warmth and light. He could hear the soft sound of the girls breathing through the open window, and he knew with a terrifying clarity that what had started as an accident of a storm and a chance encounter had become the very center of his world. But as he stood there, a new, colder fear crept into his heart. It wasn't just the town he had to worry about, it was the man who had put that star-shaped brand on the little girl's head. Judgment was coming, he knew, but it wasn't just coming from the town. It was coming from his past, and it was going to be far more brutal and unforgiving. He had a feeling the whispers in town were the least of his problems. The real storm was still on its way. Winter didn't just linger, it came back with a vengeance, as if it had been saving its cruelest breath for last. Snow piled up in massive drifts, swallowing the fence posts until only their tips were visible, like lonely gravestones in an endless sea of white. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, a high, thin sound that clawed at the walls of the cabin and rattled the lantern on its hook. Inside, Jedediah fed the fire relentlessly, splitting kindling as if he could fight back the cold with sheer force of will. The girls played quietly by the hearth, their games made of buttons and scraps of cloth. Even their laughter was a small, muffled sound, smothered by the storm's constant rage. The older girl, ever watchful, kept her sister wrapped in the big wool coat, her eyes tracking Jed's every move. She saw the exhaustion in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw the toll this was taking on him, and then, one night, as the snow piled higher and higher against the door, the younger girl started to cough. At first it was nothing, just a little tickle in her throat. But by morning it had become a harsh, ragged sound that tore from her small chest with every breath. A bright, unnatural flush appeared on her cheeks, and her forehead was hot to the touch, beaded with sweat, even though the cabin was so cold their breath misted in the air. Jed knelt beside her, his large hand gentle on her forehead. His face was a mask of worry. "She's burning up," he muttered, his voice rough with fear. The older girl's eyes went wide. "Is she going to die?" she whispered, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. He had no answer. A raw animal fear was clawing at his insides, but he couldn't let them see it. He couldn't let them feel his terror. He just tucked the blanket tighter around the small, feverish body. "I'll not lose her," he whispered, more to himself than to the girl. "Not to this." His supplies were almost gone, a handful of beans, the last of the flour, a little sugar. There was no medicine, no herbs, nothing to fight the fever that was consuming the little girl. The preacher's words came back to him, a haunting refrain: "Do justice to the afflicted and the needy." He looked at the window, at the white fury of the blizzard raging outside, and he knew what he had to do. Justice demanded a sacrifice. By noon, he had the horse saddled. His hands were raw and numb from the cold, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. The older girl grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. "Don't leave us," she pleaded. He knelt down, pressing his forehead against hers, a silent promise. "I'll come back," he swore, his voice thick. "I swear it." He put his hands on her small shoulders, trying to steady her, to give her some of his own strength. "Keep the fire alive. Hold her close. That's your job. Mine is to bring back what she needs." And then he stepped out into the storm, and it swallowed him whole. The world became a whirlwind of white. Snow lashed his face, the ice crystals feeling like tiny shards of glass against his skin. The wind howled in his ears, a symphony of rage. His horse, a strong, steady animal, stumbled and fought for every step, sinking deep into the massive drifts. Each foot forward was a victory stolen from the jaws of death. He pressed on, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He wasn't thinking of himself, of the cold that was seeping into his bones, of the very real possibility that he might freeze to death just miles from his own cabin. He was thinking of a little girl's hand resting in his just a few nights before, a simple, trusting gesture that had changed everything. That memory burned hotter than any fire, brighter than any frost. Hours bled into one another, a blur of white and wind and pain. He didn't know how he made it, but somehow, half frozen and staggering, he reached the edge of town. He practically fell from the saddle, his legs numb and useless. He burst through the door of the general store, a wild apparition of snow and desperation. Faces turned, eyes wide with shock. "Medicine," he gasped, his voice raw and fierce. "Fever. She's burning up." The shopkeeper, a man named Henderson, who had been among the whisperers, hesitated. His eyes narrowed, suspicion warring with a flicker of concern. But Jed slammed his fist down on the counter, the force of the blow rattling jars and tins on the shelves. "Don't you stall me," he roared, his voice cracking. "Not tonight." There was something in his eyes, something wild and broken, that made Henderson move. He quickly gathered herbs, powders, a bottle of laudanum, stuffing them into a sack. Jed threw a handful of coins onto the counter, not waiting for change, and stumbled back out into the teeth of the storm. But as he turned to leave, his eyes caught something tacked to the wall behind the counter. A wanted poster. It was new, the paper still crisp. The sketch was of a hard-faced man with a cruel mouth and dark eyes. The name was Marcus Blackwood, and the crime was murder. Jed's blood ran cold. It was him. The man who had put the brand on the little girl's head. He tore the poster from the wall, ignoring Henderson's cry of protest, and shoved it into his coat. The ride back was a nightmare. Night had fallen, and the wind had found a new level of fury. He burst through the cabin door, snow flying into the room. The older girl ran to him, her face streaked with tears, still clutching the blanket around her sister, who was now whimpering in a restless, fevered sleep. He fell to his knees beside the cot, his hands shaking so violently he could barely open the medicine bottle. He spilled half of it before he could steady himself enough to pour a dose onto a spoon. He gently pried the girl's lips open, tipping the medicine in, his mind a chaotic whirl of prayers and curses. "Lord, don't take her," he pleaded with the darkness. "Don't take any of them. I got nothing left to give, but whatever breath is in my body, it's theirs now." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, as if in answer. The little girl swallowed weakly, and for the first time in hours, her breathing seemed to ease, just a fraction. It wasn't a cure, not yet. But it was a foothold. It was hope. Jed bowed his head, resting it on the edge of the cot, his body shaking with exhaustion and relief. The older girl came and wrapped her small arms around his neck, pressing her face into his back. "You came back," she whispered, her voice full of a child's awe that a promise could actually be kept. He lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed but burning with a fierce light. "I told you I would." Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, the fire roared, and a fragile, unbreakable bond was being forged in the crucible of fear and desperation. The younger girl stirred again, her fevered mind drifting. She mumbled a word, soft as a falling snowflake. "Papa." Jed froze, every muscle in his body tense. The older girl looked at him, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. His shadow, cast by the flames, loomed large and protective on the wall behind him. He looked down at the sick child, then at the wanted poster he had pulled from his coat. The face of Marcus Blackwood stared back at him, a ghost from a past he could no longer outrun. This wasn't just a sickness. This was a reckoning, and it was just beginning. He touched the edge of the blanket, his voice so low it was almost a prayer. "If that's who I am now," he whispered, "then God help me be enough." Because he knew Blackwood wasn't a man who abandoned his property. Sooner or later, he'd come looking for it, and Jedediah would have to be ready. The thaw came slowly, grudgingly, as if winter itself was a bitter old man refusing to let go. But eventually, green shoots pushed their way through the muddy earth, and the air began to smell of wet soil and new beginnings. The constant dripping of melting snow from the cabin roof was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of survival. The girls, their feet bare and caked with mud, chased each other through the yard, their laughter echoing in the clear spring air. It was a sound Jedediah had come to crave, a sound that pushed back the silence he had lived in for so long. He stood by the corral, mending a broken rail, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Every few minutes, he would pause and watch them play, a quiet sense of wonder filling him. For weeks, life had settled into a fragile rhythm. 3 plates on the table instead of 1. Small mended shoes drying by the fire, 2 small voices calling him Papa. It was a life he had never imagined, a life he was terrified of losing. But peace, he knew, was a fleeting thing on the frontier, and shadows have a way of catching up to you. The whispers in town hadn't died down. They had grown, twisted, multiplied. Why would a man with no wife, a man with a past he never spoke of, take in 2 orphans? What was his claim on them? What were his real intentions? Then, one morning, as the sun struggled to burn through a thin layer of clouds, a wagon appeared on the dirt road leading to the cabin. It wasn't a neighbor's wagon. It was unfamiliar, pulled by 2 strong horses that kicked up clouds of dust. The woman holding the reins sat ramrod straight, her face hard and unyielding. The girls stopped their playing instantly. The laughter died on their lips. The older one grabbed her sister's hand, a familiar protective instinct kicking in. Jed felt his own chest tighten. He didn't need an introduction. He knew exactly who this was. The grandmother. She climbed down from the wagon, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her face a mask of cold pride. Her eyes scanned the small, rough cabin with disdain, then moved to the 2 girls, and finally they landed on Jed. "You've taken what was not yours to keep," she said, her voice as brittle as a dead leaf. "I've come for them." The younger girl whimpered and hid behind Jed's leg. The older one just stared at the woman, her small face a mixture of old fear and new defiance. "You slammed the door," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. The grandmother ignored her, her focus entirely on Jed. "It isn't fitting," she declared, "a man alone, no wife, no kinship. They belong with family, with their blood." Jed stood silent for a long moment, the hammer still heavy in his hand. He carefully placed it on the top rail of the fence. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Family cast them out," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Family left them to freeze in a blizzard. Belonging doesn't come from blood when that blood has already turned its back." Her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. But she hadn't come alone. Behind her wagon, more had appeared. The town had followed her, neighbors, the preacher, the storekeeper Henderson, all of them gathering in a silent, watching circle. Judgment had arrived. The preacher stepped forward, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon. He looked from the grandmother to Jed, and then to the two small girls trembling behind him. "The good book teaches us mercy, Jedediah," he said, his voice low and solemn, "but it also speaks of order, of what is right and proper." Jed drew in a slow, deep breath. He knew this wasn't a fight he could win with his fists, or with silence. He had only one weapon left: the truth. He turned his back on the crowd and knelt in the dirt, so he was eye to eye with the girls. His voice, when he spoke to them, was gentle, but it shook with the effort of holding himself together. "I ain't here to command you," he said softly. "I ain't here to force you into anything. But I will say this, and I'll say it plain. If you want to go with her, I will let you go. But if you want to stay, then I will fight the whole world to make that so." He reached into his coat and pulled out the crumpled wanted poster for Marcus Blackwood. He held it up for the girls, for the preacher, for the entire town to see. "This is your father," he said, his voice ringing with a terrible authority. "A murderer and a thief, and this woman," he pointed a trembling finger at the grandmother, "is not your blood. She was his partner. She kept you because he made her, and she abandoned you because he was dead, and you were no longer of any use to her." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The grandmother's face went white. "She didn't just leave you to freeze." Jed's voice grew louder, harder. "The sickness your sister had. It wasn't a fever, it was poison. A slow poison, meant to make sure you didn't survive the winter, meant to erase any trace of Marcus Blackwood." He looked at the older girl, his eyes pleading. "Tell them," he urged. "Tell them what you told me. Tell them about the special tea she made you drink every night." The older girl's chest rose and fell with a ragged breath. She looked at the man kneeling in front of her, at the cruel face of the woman on the wagon, at the shocked faces of the townspeople. A fire that had been smoldering inside her for 6 long years finally roared to life. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of a child. It was the voice of a survivor. It rang out across the silent yard, clear and strong and true. "You shut the door, Grandma," she said, her eyes locked on the woman. "He opened it. You gave us poison. He rode through a blizzard to save us. We choose him." The younger girl, emboldened by her sister, echoed the words, her small voice firm and unwavering. "We choose him." The wind died down. The birds stopped singing. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, listening. The grandmother's face crumbled. The hard mask of pride shattered, revealing the ugly truth beneath. She didn't say a word. She just scrambled back onto her wagon and whipped the horses into a gallop, fleeing the judgment she had brought down upon herself. The crowd stood in stunned silence. The preacher looked at the wanted poster in Jed's hand, then at the two girls clinging to him, and finally at Jed himself. He bowed his head, a gesture of shame and surrender. One by one, the wagons turned and headed back to town, leaving Jed and the girls alone in the quiet yard. He rose slowly to his feet, his knees aching. The girls pressed against him, burying their faces in his shirt. He wrapped his arms around them, holding them tight. His hands were trembling. His voice, when it finally came, was thick with unshed tears. "Then so be it," he whispered into their hair. You're mine, and I'm yours. Blood didn't bind us, heart did, and heart is stronger. That night, the light from the cabin window seemed to burn brighter than ever before. 3 plates sat on the table. The girls' laughter filled the small room, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. As they finally drifted off to sleep, their heads resting on his shoulders, Jedediah felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace he had never known. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man who had faced it down and won. He was a father. He looked up at the rough-hewn rafters of the small cabin, the firelight glinting in his eyes, and he made a silent vow. If this is home, I'll keep it safe. If this is family, I'll never let it fall. The storm was finally over. What did you think of Jedediah's choice? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching.